Hey everybody, this is Kevin McFarland from The Art of Emergency Nursing, and you're listening to 30 Days to Being a Badass ER Nurse. In the next 30 days, I'm going to give you some quick tips and tricks to help you be a better ER nurse. And of course, as always, it's not just me you're going to hear from. I've recruited some of my friends to give you some of their tips and tricks so they can share their knowledge as well. So don't forget to subscribe so that you catch all the episodes. And if you find one of these tips and tricks are really helpful, give me a shout out on social media and share it with your friends. Let's get into today's tip. Welcome to day 8 of the 30-day challenge, 30 days to being a badass ER nurse. And I told you yesterday when we talked about precepting that I was going to give you a little information the next day to help you better help your preceptee learn. And that's what I'm going to do today. Now, to start it off, I'm going to tell you a quick. When I was in nursing school, it was the third semester of nursing school, and it was day 1 of the third semester. We had a lecture that day from one of the instructors, and she said, "Today, guys, we're going to cover shock." And I thought to myself, great, I'm in good shape. I know shock pretty well. I teach it at every EMT class. I've studied it. I know shock. I get shock. I understand shock. And sure enough, this nursing instructor gets up in the front of the class, and she goes on and on for probably about 2 hours. And she's talking about shock. She's talking about it from the signs and symptoms to the cellular level, talking about all forms of shock, everything about shock. She got herself confused a couple times and then went back and said, no, hold on. Everything I told you is reverse. It's this way. And I was like, oh my God, you're killing me. But sure enough, she spent 2 hours, at least 2 hours, may have been closer to 3, talking about shock. And I walked out of there feeling like I thought I knew shock. Now I'm. A couple days later, during clinicals, one of the clinical instructors said to the group, "Hey guys, how do you guys feel about the shock content? Because that's going to be on the test coming up." And I remember looking at her and saying, I thought I knew shock, but I left that lecture more confused than I came in. And she said, "Okay." She's like, "Hold on, I'm going to help you guys out." She goes, "I'm going to tell you about shock, but I'm going to tell you the story of 3 patients." So she told us the story of 3 patients. One patient was experiencing hypovolemic shock. One patient was experiencing anaphylactic shock. And one patient was experiencing septic shock. She told us the 3 stories of those patients. She told us how they ended up in the hospital, what they were there for, what their signs and symptoms were, what kind of complications they had during their healing process. And she took a couple side roads and said, "Okay, now here's what's happening at the cellular level to hopefully explain this." And she explained it so well that I finally was like, okay, I know, now I've validated my understanding. I do know shock. And she explained things that I'd kind of passed up every time I explained it when I was teaching it for the EMT classes. But she did that by delivering 3. I'm going to tell you about a little something that I learned in a marketing class. And in the marketing class, marketing is all about selling, right? And one of the things that they said in this marketing class that I took said, "Facts tell, but stories sell." And what that means is I can give you all the facts and figures and tell you all that information, but how I'm going to sell you is by telling you a story. By telling you a story of someone just like you who experienced something that you might experience. And you can live then vicariously through that other person and hopefully not make the same mistakes they made. So what I'm going to challenge you as a preceptor, and you probably already do this, I'll tell you that facts tell, but stories sell. So you can tell everybody about the facts and figures, and there are a lot of things that are just factual that you just need to say, this is why you do it, and this is how you do it. But one of the stories that I always told to help solidify understanding was a simple story that I would tell people when we were labeling blood. So we were labeling blood, and the simple fact was you needed to pull off a sticker, you needed to write the date, time, and initials on every label that went on every vial. In addition to that, you had to print up the requisition, and the requisition had to accompany the blood to the lab. Facts. Those are all just the facts about labeling blood. The story was about a patient who blood was drawn, date, timed, and initialed appropriately. They were sent down, and the patient came back with a very high glucose level, like super high. The patient wasn't a known diabetic, so we were sitting there going, okay, this seems unlikely, but this patient doesn't seem like they're quite that sick. But you're telling me that like this person should be like in DKA, and they certainly didn't look like they were in DKA. So we drew the blood again. Again, date, timed, and initialed the blood tubes, sent the labs down, and the labs were completely different. Now, here's what we know. We know that that person wasn't in DKA. We know that the first lab samples that went down on that patient were probably not actually the patient's blood. Here's what we don't know. We don't know whose blood that was. Somebody there was in DKA. Somebody there was gravely ill, very, very ill. But we didn't necessarily know who that was because we had date, timed, and initialed the wrong set of labs. So I always told this story to solidify the understanding that the blood needed to be labeled at the bedside and only after checking for name verification. And by telling the story, that would help solidify that understanding in the preceptee's mind. So it was a powerful story to tell. Now, I'll tell you a little bit about stories because I love stories, and I know you do too because you listen to my podcast. If you listen to my podcast, you obviously love stories, just like me. And thank you for that. But what I'll tell you is that your preceptees, your students, the people who are learning from you, they love stories too. But what they don't necessarily want the stories where you're the hero. They don't necessarily want where you came in, you saved the day, you swooped down, you were a super nurse, and you saved everything. Very rarely do I tell those stories. Do I have a couple scenarios where that's the case? Yeah, I think we all do. We all have our huge saves, and we sometimes tell those stories. But the stories I like to tell my preceptors is when I went off the path, when I did something that I shouldn't have done. And only by the grace of God was the patient okay and was I okay. Those are the stories I want to tell, the cautionary tales that say don't make the same mistakes I've made. Be better than me. Be better than me in this one arena. Another thing I can tell you about stories is stories are a good way to connect with the people you're teaching. Because one of the things that naturally happens when we tell stories is people feel like they're getting a little closer to us. They're getting a little insight on our personality, who we are, what we do, and what we've done. So again, not only is it going to help maybe teach a lesson that maybe you had to learn the hard way, but it's going to help you connect better to the person that you're precepting. Now, I'll tell you, you got to pick your stories carefully. Make sure that the story does actually have a lesson. There is a point. You don't want just a meandering war story that just makes you sound like a hero. There's got to be a point and a lesson to be learned from the story. Oftentimes it's a simple lesson and easy to understand, easy to pick up. But just in case it's not, be ready to call out the point of the story. So for instance, in the example I gave you earlier, when I was talking about the labeling blood piece and getting that right and how critical it is really the point of that story. That's really what you want to drive home. So make sure you point that out to folks, just in case they missed it. End your stories by, again, calling out the main point and giving a strong takeaway. A strong takeaway point should follow or should be the end of that story. Okay, here's my challenge for you this week. Okay, here's my challenge for you today. I want you to give some thought to a couple of your stories. What are the main lessons? What are the learning points? What's the piece that your student needs to hear? Think about that. Think about those lessons. Think about those stories. And maybe practice those stories. Tell them to a person or two and see if they get the point, or if there's anything that you need to clarify on the story. If you want to tell me the story, you can call me at 832-299-5132. Let me give you that number one more time. 832-299-5132. That is the Art of Emergency Nursing voicemail. Leave me a message and maybe I'll include it on one of these 30-day podcasts. That's it for today. Have a good shift.
Thanks for listening to the Art of Emergency Nursing podcast. Make sure to subscribe to the podcast and follow us on Facebook.